Hey everyone, I'm Michelle with Designs by JuJu, and in today's video tutorial, we are going to be stitching the brand new Modular Elf Placemat. This placemat coordinates with the Modular Elf table runner, utensil holder, and coaster, all available from Designs by JuJu. This project requires a 5x7 hoop and is made in 11 hoopings, each of which are stitched completely in the hoop using your embroidery machine and assembled at the end using a sewing machine. For machines with a larger stitch field, there are bonus combined files included within your purchase for the main elf block and the vertical border block. Let's get started. For the In the Hoop Modular Elf Placemat, you will need the following supplies: a variety of fabrics, including applique fabric, all cut according to the supply list cut chart included within your PDF download, batting, no-show mesh cutaway stabilizer, scissors. I use these for cutting my background fabric and these for all of my applique work. SF101 fusible interfacing. I apply this to my main background fabric block. And a variety of threads. I use Floriani for most of my embroidery projects. I also have some King Star metallic and some variegated thread that I'll be using in this project. All right, let's head over to the embroidery machine and let's get stitching. All right, we're over at the embroidery machine and we're ready to get started. So the first blocks that we're going to stitch are the border horizontal center gift. Now we only need 2 of these border blocks, and within one hooping there are 2 blocks. So we're going to stitch this exact hooping one time. These same steps that we're going to do for the border horizontal center gift blocks also apply for the border horizontal ends gift blocks that we need 2 hoopings of, and the border vertical gift blocks that we also need 2 hoopings of. So this process is the exact same for those blocks. I'm not going to stitch those on camera, but when you are ready to stitch them, follow these exact same steps. All right, so I already have my no-show mesh cutaway stabilizer hooped into my 5x7 hoop, and we're ready to get started. And the first stitch is going to be the placement line for my batting. Next, I'm going to place a piece of batting directly over this placement line, making sure that all of the stitches are completely covered. And next, I'm going to run the tack down that is going to secure that batting in place. Okay, so I just removed my hoop and trimmed away the excess batting right along that tack down line. So now, using my batting tack down line as a placement line, I'm going to place my background fabric directly on top, making sure that all of the tack down stitches are completely covered. And I'm going to smooth my fabric, and then I'm going to run the tack down to secure my background fabric in place. The next stitch is a decorative gift stitch that's going to stitch all over this. It's a quilting motif, so I'm going to go ahead and let that stitch run, and then we'll check back in when it's finished. The first block in this hooping is complete, so now I'm going to repeat those exact same steps to complete and stitch the second block within this hooping. So the first thing I would recommend doing is taking this first block that you did in this excess background fabric. I would just fold it over and tape it off to the side. I'm just using some paper medical tape to secure that out of the way. And like I said, I'm just going to repeat those exact same steps to complete a second block within this hooping. All right, I've just finished stitching the border horizontal center gift block. And like I said, there are 2 blocks within this one hooping. I am going to repeat these exact same steps for my border horizontal end gifts. And this one requires 2 hoopings. So you'll have 4 blocks total. I'm going to repeat those exact same steps additionally for my border vertical gifts. And again, there are 2 hoopings so that you have 4 total blocks. And then that completes all of our border blocks. All right, so let's go ahead and head on over and finish the next block. All right, now we are ready to stitch the side diagonal patchwork block, and you will need 4 total blocks for this portion. So what I'm going to show you here is you do have 2 options for these diagonal blocks. We have option A, like so, and we also have option B. And as you can tell, the angles of the stripes are a little bit different. So you can decide if you want 4 where the diagonal stripes go all the same direction, where you can line them up, or you can do option A and B, where your stripes kind of meet in the middle. They go towards the middle. Okay, so I have decided for my modular placemat that I'm going to be doing 2 of option A and 2 of option B. So I already have 3 blocks stitched. I did 2B and I have 1A complete. So I'm ready to do another option A, and we're going to stitch that on camera. So I already have my no-show mesh cutaway stabilizer loaded into my 5x7 hoop, and I'm ready to run the first stitch, which is going to be the placement line for my batting. Next, I'm going to take my batting and lay it directly over that placement line, making sure that all of the stitches are covered, and I'm going to run the tack down stitches to secure that batting in place. Next, I'm going to remove my hoop from my machine and trim away the excess stabilizer right along that tack down line. Okay, now I'm ready to run my next stitch, which is going to be the placement line for my top fabric. Okay, so now that we're ready to start laying our fabrics, I do want to point out that the fabrics you choose here, you want them to line up. Okay, so on my block B here, you have your top fabric, your middle fabric, and your bottom fabric. Now, since we're going to attach these 2 blocks together with our sewing machine at the end here, they're going to look like this when they're assembled. So whatever fabric you use on the top and the bottom is what you want to use on the top and the bottom for the second block. Okay, so to have this one match my block A that I've already stitched, I need to use my green fabric on the top, my tree fabric in the middle, and my green fabric on the bottom. So now that my placement line is stitched, I'm going to lay my green background fabric directly on top of those stitches, and I'm just going to make sure that all the sides are covered. Refer to the cutting chart in your PDF for specific sizing for your fabric. And now I'm going to run the tack down line to secure that fabric in place. You can trim away some of that excess fabric if you prefer. Just make sure that you don't nick any of the stitches as you're cutting. And you want to make sure that you have at least a 1/2 inch around the outer edge for assembly. Okay, so now I'm going to run the placement line for my middle fabric. All right, so let's see if I can show you that placement line. Okay, so we have 2 stitch lines here. The bottom one is the one that tacked down my top fabric, and this top line is going to be the stitch line, the placement line for my middle fabric. So what we're going to do here, I have my middle fabric here. I have a right side and then the wrong side. So I'm going to lay this face down parallel, making sure that I'm covering that placement line. And we are going to stitch this to tack it down. It's going to run a stitch right here. And then I'm going to flip it so it's right side up next. Okay, so let's run the tack down to secure that fabric in place. Okay, and then I'm going to take that fabric and fold it forward like so. Press that seam with my finger. And now we're going to stitch it to tack it down, okay? So we're on stitch step 7. That's going to tack down this fabric. And you can see it's secure from that tack down line. So now we just need to tack down the bottom part. We call this flip and stitch. Okay, so now what we're ready to do, again, you can trim away some of that excess fabric if you would like to. And then we're going to be ready to run the next placement line and tack down for our third fabric. All right, so I've just trimmed away some of that excess fabric. Now we're ready to run the placement line for the bottom fabric. And again, we're going to use the flip and stitch method for that bottom fabric. Okay, so I've just stitched my placement line for my fabric. It's right above that bottom tack down line. And again, I want to use the exact same fabric for this bottom piece that I used on the top piece so that when it lines up, it makes a complete stripe. So since I'm doing the flip and stitch method, I have my right side, my wrong side. I'm going to flip it so the wrong side is facing up, and I'm going to place it parallel to that placement line. And now I'm going to tack down that fabric. Now we flip it like so. Press it again with your finger and stitch it. All right, this block is complete. So here's what it looks like when it is completely trimmed around. I've removed the excess stabilizer and I have a 1/2 inch allowance all the way around, and that'll be very important when we get to the assembly process here at the end. So remember, you need 4 total blocks. You can either have 4 of option A, or you can have 2 of option A and 2 of option B. All right, let's get over and stitch the next block. All right, we are ready to stitch our final block, which is going to be our main elf top block. Now, if you have a machine that has a hoop capability of a 7 by 12 hoop, there is actually a combined block that you can stitch that combines both the top and bottom blocks. I'm using my 5 by 7 hoop, so this last block is actually stitched in 2 parts. You have the top elf and then the bottom elf. I've already stitched my bottom elf, so here's what it looks like. So now we're going to stitch the top elf that's going to be stitched to this bottom elf when we finish the assembly process here in just a little bit. So I'm ready to go ahead and get stitching. I already have my no-show mesh cutaway stabilizer hooped into my 5 by 7 hoop, like I said, and I'm going to go ahead and run the first stitch, which is going to be the placement line for my batting. Next, I'm going to lay my batting directly on top of that placement line. I'm going to smooth it out, and then I'm going to run the tack down stitch that is going to secure my batting. Next, I'm going to remove my hoop from my machine and trim away that excess batting right along the tack down line. The next stitch is going to be the placement line for the background fabric. I'm going to place my background fabric directly on top of that placement line, and I went ahead and fused some SF101 to the back of my background fabric to provide some added support and stability for my satin and decorative stitches that I will be doing soon. So that's already on there, and now I'm ready to tack down my background fabric. Next, I'm going to remove my hoop from my machine and trim away some of this excess background fabric. All right, I've just trimmed away some of the excess background fabric, and I want to show you what that looks like. So I have cut these pieces here at an angle. That way, when I go to assemble this project here in just a little bit, I want to have enough of this excess fabric so that when I stitch this block together, it will help catch this fabric as well, and that'll make more sense when we do the next stitches. I made sure that I left at least a 1/2 inch overhang on this side, again for the assembly process. And then I removed all of this excess that was around the edges here because that helps to take away some of the bulk when I go to stitch my next background pieces, my border pieces here. You don't want a lot of fabric under there, otherwise it can look bulky and can really add a lot of excess fabric into your project, making it difficult to stitch. All right, so I'm going to put this back onto my machine and we'll be ready for the next stitch. All right, now that we have our main background fabric on, we're ready to start adding some of the border pieces. So this first stitch is going to be a placement line for my first border piece, and we're actually going to be using the flip and stitch method. So if you've never made an in the hoop project with the flip and stitch method, I'm going to show you how to do that now. But the first stitch, like I said, is going to be the placement line for my border fabric. Okay, so as you can see, I have 2 stitches here. This outermost stitch is the one that's tacked down my background fabric, and the stitch that just occurred, the stitch that's on the inner part here, that's going to be the placement line for my border fabric here that I'm going to be applying here in just a minute. All right, we want to lay our border fabric right side facing down, so you'll see the back side of the fabric. And since mine's kind of directional, I'm gonna get it exactly how I want it. And I need to overhang that placement line about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. Okay, so once I have it, I'm just gonna smooth it with my finger, load it back onto my machine, and now I'm going to run the tack down that's going to secure this border fabric in place. All right, now that that fabric is secure, what I'm going to do is take this border fabric and flip it so it's right side facing up. And as you can see, it's secure now. That tack down stitch secured it in place to my background fabric. So I flipped it. I'm just going to press it with my finger, load it back onto my machine, and run the second tack down stitch, which is going to run the outer part of this stitch to secure it all the way in place. Next, I'm going to remove my hoop from my machine and trim away some of this excess fabric. Okay, I've just trimmed away some of the bulk, so now we're going to keep going. We're going to repeat those exact same steps for the bottom and the top border pieces. All right, I've just finished all of the flip and stitch border pieces. So now we're ready to do the applique work and our decorative and satin stitches. So if you have never done applique stitches before, we do have a step-by-step video that will be linked below in our description box for how to do that. But I'm going to go ahead and run my applique stitches, and then we'll check back in, and then we'll be ready to do decorative, and we'll finish this block off. All right, I've just finished all of the applique work for the top block, and I wanted to point out a very important step within the applique work. So as you can see, right here along this bottom part, I have left all of my applique pieces long. So this piece is going to be, this bottom part here is the part that I'm going to stitch to the bottom block of my elf. So you remember how I said there are 2 blocks within this elf centerpiece. There's the top block and the bottom block. So this part here, this bottom line is where I'm going to stitch and adhere my second block, the bottom block to. So I want to keep these applique pieces that are along this bottom edge long, because if I cut them right up next to the edge, as I'm stitching my project, some of this loose thread can start to fray and can actually peek through on your seam line, especially when we get to the assembly part. If you don't stitch it right along those lines, you can have a lot of issues with that. So I just like to keep mine long. That helps to ensure that when I assemble this, these longer pieces are tucked in and they don't peek out. So that's just something to point out, especially as you trim your applique fabric. I also like to use these curved tip applique scissors when I do my applique work, because I just find that it allows me to get close to the stitches without actually trimming any of the stitches. All right, so now I'm going to load this back onto my hoop, and I'm going to finish out this block with my decorative and satin stitches. I'm going to do those stitches off camera, and then we'll check back in at the end. All right, I've just finished stitching my top elf block, and it is adorable. So now we're ready to remove this from our hoop and trim away the excess stabilizer and fabric, and we're ready to start the assembly process. All right, I've just laid out all of the blocks for my placemat, and as you can see, I have my entire border, my side pieces, and then my large center block that we're going to assemble here in a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to start in the top left corner and work our way across to make strips of equal length. So I'm going to start at the top, I'm going to go to the second row, stitch across, third row, stitch across, and fourth row, the bottom row, and stitch across. So I'm going to move all of these pieces out of the way here, all of these extra blocks, and I'm going to start first with my top border. Okay, so I have my top row here laid out, and this has my 3 border blocks that I'm going to start with. These again were along the very top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the first block on the left, and I'm going to lay this block face down on top of our main center border block, and I'm going to line up the outermost stitch lines of these 2 blocks. So as you can see, you just kind of want to line them up the best you can, like so. You can also take a pin and poke it through the outermost stitch of both corners, and that will help secure that point for you while you line the rest of the block up. You can either use pins to secure. I myself prefer to use sewing clips because they're just easy for me to maneuver, especially as I go to my sewing machine and start to stitch this block together. So I'm going to go all the way around and pin or stitch in place. Okay, so we have our outermost stitch line, which if you remember, that outermost stitch line secured our background fabric to our backing and our stabilizer. And then we have the inner stitch line, which was for our tack down of our batting. So we're going to stitch just inside this outermost stitch line to secure these 2 blocks together. So I'm going to head over to my sewing machine and run that stitch real quick. All right, so I'm over here at my sewing machine, and I've already dropped my needle right inside that outermost tack down stitch, and I'm going to go ahead and run a stitch that's going to run right inside the outermost stitch line. Okay, and if I've done this step correctly, when I unfold these blocks, you can see they are lined up perfectly, and there are no additional stitch lines seen in between the 2. All right, so we're going to repeat this step for the remaining block along our top border. Okay, so I have my strip I just sewed. Now I'm going to attach this strip to this one, and again, I'm going to flip it right sides together, pin and clip in place, and then I'm going to stitch just inside that outermost tack down line again. And there it is. Our top row is completely stitched together. So now I'm going to repeat that step for the second row. All right, now we're ready to work on the second row. So as you can see, I have my border block, my side block, my patchwork block, my main block, another patch block, and then there's a second border block over here. It barely fits in frame. So what we're going to do, we're going to start on the left-hand side over here, flip right sides together, stitch. And then once this is together, I'm going to keep working my way down the row until I have a full strip like I did on the top block. Okay, now that I have my middle section also stitched together, my middle strip, I've also went ahead and pressed open my seams to help it lay flat. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch my top border, my top strip, onto my middle strip. And I'm going to do the exact same process that I did for the rest of the assembly process. I'm going to take this piece, flip it right sides together, line it up along that edging, and then I'm going to clip and stitch right inside that outermost stitch line. Now, something to point out here is you want these seams to line up with these seams, okay? That will give it a much cleaner and crisp look. So as you're lining up those stitches, make sure that you have these seams also lined up with these seams. I tend to start in this middle section when I line up to make sure that it's lined up properly, and then I work my way out. I find that much easier for getting my project lined up exactly how I want it. Okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to stitch it, and then we'll check it out. All right, I've just stitched together my top border and my middle section. I am going to repeat these exact same steps for my second middle section and my bottom border to create 2 half pieces. Okay, so I'm going to do that part off camera and then we'll check back in when that's finished. All right, so I've just completed stitching together the bottom half of my placemat, and now I'm ready to stitch the top half to the bottom half. I'm going to follow the exact same process that I have been for the rest of the placemat, and I'm going to take the top half of the section and flip it face down, right sides together, and I'm going to line up these seams and stitch it on that outermost stitch line. Now this one is extremely important that you get it lined up correctly, because with this elf, you want to make sure those hands and that tree match up as closely as they possibly can. So really take your time with your pinning and clipping here. It will make a big difference if you decide to rush. It can look a little bit wonky. So take your time, pin and clip it as close to matching up as you possibly can, and then we'll be ready to stitch it together. Okay, so I've just stitched my placemat together, and I did want to show you that even we make mistakes when we stitch these projects together. So I was so focused on getting these center blocks lined up, which I do think I did a pretty good job, but look over here. This is what I was talking about with lining up those seams. So you can see some additional stitching here in the middle. I don't want those stitches to show. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tear out the stitches from this seam over to my edge. I'm going to reline up this section and I'm going to restitch it. But everyone makes mistakes. That's the fun part about handmade projects, is they're handmade. No two things are going to look alike. So I'm just going to try that little section again. If you don't want to mess with that part, you don't have to, because handmade is fun and it's okay to have little flaws and things in your project. It's not a big deal. But I did want to show you that's what that looks like. If you don't quite have your seams lined up right, you'll see some additional stitching. So I'm going to tear that out and try it again. There we go. That looks so much better. So you can see I just used a seam ripper, ripped out that small section, and it looks a lot better now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this over to my iron and press open those remaining seams here on the back. And then I will be ready to add my backing fabric. All right, so now I'm ready to add my backing fabric, and I already have my backing fabric here. I'm just using the one that coordinates with the border that I used around the main elf quilt block there in the middle. So I'm going to lay my background fabric face down, and make sure you refer to the supply list for the cut chart that you need, the amount of background fabric you need for your placemat. And here I have it. Okay, so I'm just going to line it up in the center, and using my sewing pins here, I'm going to secure my placemat to the backing fabric. And then once that part is complete, I'm going to stitch in the ditch. So I'm going to go around the entire placemat and stitch in all of the seam lines to help secure the placemat to the backing fabric. When you stitch in the ditch, you're just stitching right in between that seam line. I just line my needle up and I just stitch right through it all the way across, and that just helps to secure this placemat to the backing fabric. So I'm going to go do those 2 steps, and then we'll be ready to finish off this placemat. All right, so I've just stitched my placemat to my backing, and then I went ahead and used my rotary cutter and my straight edge ruler to trim 1 1/4 inch excess around each side of the placemat. You want 1 1/4 inch of the backing to overhang for the binding process. So I'm ready to go ahead and start binding my placemat. We have a very detailed step-by-step blog post about a variety of different binding methods that I'm going to link in the description box below. There are also some step-by-step pictures included within your PDF download for how you can bind your placemat. I'm going to bind mine off camera, and then we'll check back in at the end. All right, I've just finished all of our binding, so let's go take a look at this adorable placemat. We've just completed our modular elf placemat, and as you saw, we stitched 11 blocks completely in the hoop and assembled using our sewing machine at the end. We used a variety of techniques with our blocks, including the flip and stitch method for our patchwork side blocks and our main center block. I also showed you how to line up your stitches as you assemble your blocks, and how it's especially important when you line up these center blocks here so that your stitches match almost perfectly. This is a fun and festive piece that is sure to brighten up any table this holiday season. I hope you have enjoyed today's tutorial. Make sure to subscribe and don't forget to check the description box below for lots of helpful links. Also, make sure that you join the Designs by JuJu Blessings Facebook group for more tips, tricks, and inspiration. Happy stitching!